The east wing of Ashford Hall had not been properly warm in 7 years, and on the morning that Eleanor first walked through its outer door with the portrait restorer behind her, the cold came up through the flagstones and settled in the hem of her gown, like something that had been waiting for her. She stopped at the threshold of the long gallery without meaning to. 14 portraits in varying states of neglect lined the walls between the tall, narrow windows, their frames dark with the particular grime of a room that had been sealed and unsealed at irregular intervals for the better part of a decade. The light came in low and grey, November light, the colour of old pewter. She had not been in this room since her uncle died. Dixon was a step behind her, carrying a worn leather case of tools, saying nothing. She had expected, from Lady Harriet's description of him, a man of fussy disposition and elaborate professional opinion. What had arrived at Ashford Hall 2 days before was something else. He was perhaps 35, with a steadiness of bearing that she could not easily account for, and hands that, when he opened his case in the East Wing study, moved with a deliberateness that made her think of a man accustomed to being in rooms and taking their full measure before committing to any action. She had told herself this was nothing. Portrait restorers presumably developed a professional stillness. The quality of attention required by old canvas would reward a methodical temperament. She told herself this and moved further into the gallery and kept her eyes on the paintings. It was the autumn of 1831, and Eleanor Ashford had managed the household accounts at Ashford Hall for 4 years. She had begun when she was 18, after the steward her uncle had employed was found to have been systematically misdirecting funds toward a property investment in Lincolnshire. She had found the discrepancy in the quarterly ledger herself, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the library, the kind of discovery that required her to sit very still for several minutes and then go quietly to her uncle. He had thanked her, dismissed the steward, and handed her the account books without further ceremony. Her uncle had died 2 years later. Lady Harriet, his widow, had retained the account books in Eleanor's hands because it was useful to do so, and had retained nothing else of Eleanor's standing with any consistency. Lady Harriet was her father's sister, not her mother's, a distinction that would become important. The arrangement with Dixon had been Lady Harriet's idea, or rather, it had been the idea of Sir Reginald Phelps, who had mentioned at dinner 3 weeks prior that the East Wing portraits would require attention before any formal announcement of the estate's future was made public. He had said this with the proprietorial ease of a man who considered himself already half installed at Ashford Hall, which he was, in the sense that Lady Harriet had all but contracted for the arrangement without consulting Eleanor directly. Eleanor was 22 and possessed of what Harriet privately described to her acquaintances as limited prospects, which meant that her dowry was modest, and her mother's history was the kind that Harriet felt required careful management. Eleanor had heard this phrase used at least twice through the morning room door, which was old and did not fit its frame with any precision. Dixon came to stand beside her at the far end of the gallery, where 2 portraits hung at angles that suggested they had been rehung by someone with different wall measurements in mind. He looked at them for a long moment, not speaking. "The one on the left has suffered moisture damage along the lower third," he said at last. "The varnish has clouded. It is not irreparable, but it is the first priority." "There is also one in the study," Eleanor said. "The small one. It was moved there when my uncle reorganized the room." She did not say anything more about it. She led him through the connecting door into the East Wing study, which was a smaller room with a single fireplace that smoked slightly if the wind was from the north, a writing table, and a chair with a cracked leather seat. The portrait she had mentioned was hanging on the wall beside the window, half hidden behind a curtain that had been tied back unevenly. Dixon crossed the room toward it, set his case down on the writing table, and looked at the portrait. He stood there for a moment without speaking, and Eleanor, watching him from the doorway, saw something shift in his face. It was not a dramatic change. It was the slight tightening around the eyes that meant a person had encountered something they had not expected to find. "Do you know who she is?" Eleanor asked. "I know the style," he said. "The hand is Ramsay, or close to it. Later period." She waited, and he added nothing more. She could not have said why she felt that his answer was not quite the answer to her question. She left him to begin his preliminary assessment and walked back through the gallery, her footsteps steady on the flagstones, the cold following her all the way to the main corridor. The woman in the portrait was her mother. Eleanor had known this from the moment she entered the study. The painting had been in her uncle's collection since before she could remember, and she had sat with it in this room as a child, on Sunday afternoons, when the rain was heavy and the rest of the house was occupied. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 6. The portrait was the clearest image she had of her. She had not known Dixon would react to it. She had no means of knowing what that reaction meant. The next morning was cold enough that the east wing passage had frost along the lower edge of its north-facing window. Mrs. Pond, the housekeeper, mentioned at breakfast that the underfootman had not laid the fire in the east wing study, having been occupied with the Phelps guest rooms in the main house since Sir Reginald had sent word he intended to arrive by Thursday. Eleanor finished her correspondence at the writing desk in the main library, then went to the coal room off the kitchen passage and filled a small brass scuttle herself. Mrs. Pond saw her doing this and said nothing, which was one of the things Eleanor appreciated about Mrs. Pond. The housekeeper had been at Ashford Hall since before Eleanor's mother arrived as a bride, and she had a quality of watchful sympathy that she expressed primarily through a capacity to find the right moment to disappear. Eleanor carried the scuttle through the east wing passage and into the study. Dixon was seated at the writing table with the clouded portrait from the gallery laid out before him on a protective cloth, working with a small brush and what appeared to be a diluted solvent. He glanced up at her entry and then at the scuttle. "You did not need to do that," he said. "The fire in your room had gone out," she said, and set the scuttle beside the grate. She began laying the coals herself, because the fire irons were already there, and it was a straightforward matter, and she had not come all the way down the cold passage to return with the job undone. He watched her, and she was aware of being watched, but the awareness was not uncomfortable. There was nothing evaluative in it. It was more like the attention one pays to something unexpected, held steady and without comment. The fire caught. She stood up and brushed her palms together once, briefly. "What do you know of the painter's technique?" she asked, because she genuinely wanted to know, and because she had been watching him work for a moment, and had noticed that his brushstrokes followed a pattern she could not quite interpret. He considered this for longer than was strictly necessary for a man answering a practical question. "Ramsay was interested in fabric," he said at last, "more than most of his contemporaries. You can see it in the way he handled the light on silk. The cloud in this varnish has flattened that texture completely. Once it is cleared, the shoulder of her gown will read differently." He was looking at the portrait again, and Eleanor looked with him. "She was a woman of some quality," he added, still to the canvas rather than to her. Eleanor said, "Yes, and nothing else," and after a moment, she left him to his work. She turned that observation over in her mind during the 2 days that followed. She turned it over while she updated the household accounts in the library, recording the costs of Sir Reginald's arrival. 6 dozen tallow candles, additional hamper from the merchant at Melton, a new set of fire irons for the main guest suite, because Harriet had decided the old ones did not suit. She turned it over while she read through the correspondence that needed her attention, 3 letters from tenants, and one from the estate solicitor regarding a boundary question on the western paddock. She turned it over on the Thursday evening when Sir Reginald arrived, stepping down from his carriage with the air of a man surveying his future property, shaking the gravel from his boots and pausing in the main doorway long enough to take in the hall with a slow, proprietary satisfaction. Sir Reginald was 41, with a fine coat and a habit of addressing Eleanor with a slightly increased volume, as though she was standing at a greater distance than she actually was. He had a property in Warwickshire and a modest income, and what Harriet described as excellent family connections, which Eleanor understood to mean connections that were better than her own. He spoke at dinner about drainage improvements at his Warwickshire estate with the sustained authority of a man confident his audience had nothing of equal interest to offer, and Harriet listened with an expression of careful encouragement. Eleanor listened with the portion of her attention that was not occupied with the butter dish, which was nearly empty and which the footman had not noticed. After dinner, in the drawing-room, Harriet spoke with pointed warmth about the eastern aspect of Ashford Hall, the view from the long gallery windows, the history of the gardens. Eleanor sat at the small writing table near the window and addressed 2 envelopes that had been waiting since morning. She was aware of being discussed in the third person while present in the room, which was not a new experience. The following morning she went to the East Wing again, this time to bring Dixon the list of all 14 portraits with her notes on their condition and history, compiled from her uncle's records. She had spent an hour with those records the night before and had found more than she expected. Her uncle had acquired 11 of the 14 himself. 3 had come with the house from the previous family, who had vacated Ashford Hall in 1809. Dixon was working on the small portrait from the study, which he had moved to better light near the south-facing window. He received the list from her without comment and read through it with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Occasionally he made a small mark in the margin with a pencil he kept behind his ear. "You compiled this yourself?" he asked when he reached the 3rd page. "From my uncle's records, yes. He acquired the collection over roughly 20 years. 23, she said. The first was purchased in 1808. That one," and she indicated the portrait nearest the door, a landscape study rather than a figure, "was the last, 6 months before he died." He looked up from the list then, not at the painting, but at her. It was a brief look, direct and quiet. "You know the collection well," he said. "I grew up with it." He returned to the list. After a moment he said, "The small portrait. The woman in the blue dress. She is not recorded here." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, one of the stable lads was crossing the yard with a bucket, walking fast against the wind. "No," she said. "She is not." He waited. "She was my mother," Eleanor said. "My uncle acquired the portrait before I was born. I do not know the precise date." He said nothing for a long moment. Then he set the list down on the cloth beside the portrait and said, with the care of a man choosing his words individually, "She was well regarded, before her marriage and after it." Eleanor looked at him. "I mean," he said, "that the quality of the commission speaks well of the family's esteem for her. The artist does not paint a woman like this for a subject in whom he has no interest. There is care in it." It was a strange thing to say, and said strangely, and she thought about it all the rest of that morning. She was in the library that afternoon when she heard them. She had come to return the estate ledgers to the shelf along the north wall, and the door between the library and the small sitting-room beyond it was not quite closed. She had not noticed this. She placed the first ledger on the shelf, reached for the second, and heard her aunt's voice through the gap, clear and unhurried, saying something about Eleanor's mother. She stood very still. "The woman died in circumstances that were, at best, unfortunate," Lady Harriet was saying. She had the tone she used for information of consequence, delivered to an audience of one. A debt of some significance was involved, as well as a connection that the family found it necessary to conceal. My brother did not speak of it openly. I should not speak of it now, except that you ought to understand the nature of what you are accepting when you accept Eleanor. Sir Reginald's voice, lower, said something she could not quite catch. The mother's history does not transfer, Harriet said. That is my point. Eleanor is without blemish in her conduct. What she carries is the stain of a name that was managed rather than honoured. You would be doing the girl a considerable service. The silence that followed had a particular quality. The quality of a man being asked to consider a transaction and finding the terms acceptable. Eleanor put the second ledger on the shelf with the same steadiness she would have used if her hands had been completely still. They were not completely still. She stood in front of the shelves for a moment, looking at the spines of the books without reading any of them. Then she picked up the third ledger and placed it in its position. She did not go into the sitting room. She did not raise her voice. She had no instrument in that house that would have made raising her voice effective, and she was too honest with herself to waste effort on instruments that would not work. She went back to her writing desk and finished the letter she had begun that morning to the estate solicitor regarding the boundary question on the western paddock. She described the situation clearly, requested a clear answer, and signed her name. The letter to the solicitor was dispatched before 4 o'clock. That evening, at dinner, she was her usual self at the table. She spoke when spoken to, offered a considered opinion when Sir Reginald made an observation about the condition of the east wing that she knew to be inaccurate, and ate her soup without drawing particular attention. Harriet watched her once, with an expression Eleanor could not fully read, somewhere between satisfaction and a more cautious species of assessment. Dixon was not at dinner. He had taken his meals in the East Wing study since his arrival, a fact that Harriet accepted without complaint, because he was, in her understanding, a tradesman of the better sort, and the arrangement was convenient. Eleanor had once, passing the study door at 7:30 in the evening, seen the light of 2 candles on the table and his shadow bent over the portrait of her mother, and had kept walking. She found him the next morning in the gallery, measuring the frames of the 2 portraits that had been rehung at wrong angles, making notes in a small book he kept in his coat pocket. She told him what she intended to do with the day, which was her habit now, giving him a summary of where she would be in case any question arose about the collection, and he listened in the way he always listened, which was with his full attention, rather than with part of it. "You seem," he said carefully, in the middle of her account, "as though you have slept poorly." It was not an impertinence. It was simply an observation, offered without agenda. "I am well enough," she said. He returned to his measuring. Then, without looking up from the frame, he said, "Ramsay's subjects often looked as though they were enduring something gracefully. It is what makes the portraits worth the commission." He found that quality interesting. She understood that he was not talking about paint. "The portrait of my mother," she said. "When did you first see it?" He looked up from his notebook then. He held her eyes for a moment, and she had the distinct impression that he was making a decision about something. "Some years ago," he said. "Before you came to Ashford Hall." "Yes." She waited. "She was known to people I knew," he said. "She was considered by those who were in a position to know a woman of genuine character." Eleanor said, "My aunt says otherwise." "I know what your aunt says." It came out with a quiet certainty that was not quite what a portrait restorer, who had arrived 5 days ago, ought to be able to say with that degree of confidence. She noticed this. She filed it beside the bearing and the steadiness and the way he moved in rooms. She walked back to the library and wrote no letters for half an hour, only sat at her desk with her hands in her lap. The drawing room in the main body of Ashford Hall had a marble fireplace, with a slightly chipped mantle that Eleanor had always meant to have repaired. And on the Saturday afternoon of Sir Reginald's 4th day in residence, Harriet assembled 3 of her local acquaintances for what she called an informal gathering and what was, in practice, a witnessed announcement. Eleanor had not been informed of this. She learned of it from Mrs. Pond, who found her in the linen room shortly after noon with the expression of someone who wanted to deliver bad news before it arrived by other means. "Lady Harriet has written to Mrs. Cleeve and Miss Fortescue and the Wentworth girl," Mrs. Pond said, "and they are all expected at 3. Cook has been told to prepare a cold supper." Eleanor thanked her and went to change into her good morning dress, the grey silk with the cream undersleeve, because she understood what the gathering was and it seemed right to meet it with good dress. At 3 o'clock the drawing room held 6 people, counting Eleanor. Harriet was positioned near the fireplace in the way she always stood when she intended to address the room as a group. Sir Reginald occupied the chair nearest the window with an ease that communicated settled habitation. The 3 acquaintances sat in a composed semicircle on the settee, and the 2 side chairs with the expressions of women who have been told something interesting is about to happen. "We are very glad to have our friends with us this afternoon," Harriet began, which was her standard opening when the real content was still 2 sentences away. "And we are glad, above all, to share with you a piece of news that reflects well on this house and on its family." She paused here for the appropriate duration. "Sir Reginald has done my niece the great honour of a formal offer, which I have received on her behalf with all the pleasure that such an offer merits." The 3 acquaintances smiled in the way that acquaintances smile at announcements that have been signalled well in advance. Sir Reginald inclined his head with the gravity of a man accepting congratulation. Eleanor sat in the chair near the writing table and kept her face entirely composed, because she had no other option, and because she had calculated, sometime during the previous night when sleep declined to arrive, that composed was the only form of presence she currently had access to. The door opened. It was not a footman, or not only a footman. It was one of the outer staff, a young man named Turner, who generally managed deliveries to the East Wing, and he was holding a letter on a small silver tray, and he was looking for Dixon. He had clearly been told that Dixon was somewhere in the main house. He stood in the drawing-room doorway with the careful alarm of a man who had walked into a room he had not expected to find occupied with company, and he scanned the room, and his eyes landed on the man standing near the far wall, who was Dixon, who had apparently arrived in the drawing-room sometime in the last quarter of an hour and positioned himself at the edge of the gathering without being formally included in it. "Beg pardon, Your Grace," Turner said with the automatic deference of a young man addressing a rank he had heard used. "A courier from London. He said you would be expecting it." The tray with the letter was extended. The seal visible at the fold was in dark blue wax, a device not locally known. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when something has just reorganized itself and the room has not yet adjusted to the new configuration. Eleanor watched Harriet's face. Harriet was looking at the letter, at the seal, at Turner's expression of settled expectation. And then, with the slow movement of a woman whose fixed understanding of a room has just been fundamentally altered, at Dixon, at the man she had called a portrait restorer, at the man who had been eating his supper in the East Wing study for 5 days, at the man who was now being addressed as Your Grace by a young member of her own household with no hesitation and no uncertainty. Sir Reginald had gone still in his chair. Dixon took the letter from the tray. He looked at Turner with the brief, level look of a man who understood exactly what had just occurred and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Thank you, Turner," he said. "You may go." Turner went. The room held its silence. Harriet said, "I don't," and stopped. She tried again. "I was not aware that," and stopped again. Dixon put the letter in his coat pocket. He looked at Harriet with a calm that was not unkind, but was also entirely without concession. "My name is Daniel Ashworth," he said, and the name settled into the room with a weight that the name Dixon had never carried. "Duke of Carrow. I came to this house under a private arrangement because I had a particular interest in the collection." He paused once, very briefly. "And in the house." Sir Reginald stood up. He did this slowly, with the expression of a man who has just had the floor tilt beneath him and is deciding whether dignity requires departure or explanation. He chose departure, or at least the preparation for it. He reached for his gloves from the arm of the chair. Harriet had not moved. She was holding herself in the posture she used for receiving unpleasant information, upright and with her hands clasped at her waist. But her face had lost its social management entirely. "You deceived this household," she said. "I was less than fully honest about my name," he said. "My conduct was not deceptive." Mrs. Cleeve on the settee had pressed her lips together in the particular way of a woman who intends to remember this precisely. Harriet turned to Eleanor then, and Eleanor saw in her face the rapid recalculation of a woman whose social arithmetic has just been overturned. The expression moved through several stages. The awareness that her treatment of Eleanor had been witnessed by a duke for the past 2 weeks. The awareness that the announcement just made, the one about Sir Reginald, had been heard by him. The awareness that the drawing room full of witnesses was now oriented toward Eleanor in a way it had never been, while Eleanor was merely a niece with limited prospects. Eleanor said nothing. She was sitting in the same chair she had occupied at the beginning of the gathering, and she had not moved, and she did not need to. Daniel spoke then to Eleanor directly for the first time in front of others with the full weight of what he was. "Your mother was Margaret Ashford," he said, "born Wyndham before her marriage. Her father held the Wyndham barony until his death in 1809, and she was acknowledged in that family with full honour throughout her life. There was a debt. It was her husband's, not hers. It was settled in its entirety by her own family before she died. She left Ashford Hall with her name intact. What was done with her history after she left it is a matter I think requires some correction." The acquaintances on the settee were, as a group, very still. Harriet said, "You could not have known," and trailed off. "I knew her," he said simply. The words settled in the room. Eleanor looked at him. She was thinking of the morning she had found him in the study, looking at the portrait and the slight adjustment of his face that she had noticed and not named. She was thinking of his saying, with a certainty no portrait restorer from outside the county ought to have had, that her mother was well regarded. She was thinking of a man who had sat in a cold room in the east wing of a house that was not his, and worked, with patient and specific care, on 14 paintings that mostly were not the one he had come to see. She thought of the coals, of the fire she had laid in the east wing grate while he worked, of the quality of attention he had brought to watching her do it, which she had called at the time the attention one pays to something unexpected. She understood now what she had been unexpected from. He had known her mother. He had come to this house carrying that knowledge, under a false name, to see whether Eleanor Ashford was the person her mother had believed she would be. The thought landed without anger. She turned it over once, fully, and found that what she felt was not the injury of having been tested, but something quieter and more complicated, the recognition of being known through a history that had been hidden from her. Sir Reginald was moving toward the door by increments, having decided that departure was, after all, the dignified choice. He paused at the threshold long enough to bow in Eleanor's direction, briefly and without warmth, and then he was gone. His boots on the main staircase were the only sound for a moment. Harriet remained in the room. She looked at Eleanor, and Eleanor looked back at her, and the silence between them was a complete account of the last 4 years, written in the air of a drawing room, read by both of them, witnessed by 3 acquaintances from the village who would not forget any part of it. "I believe," Eleanor said at last, quietly and without inflection, "that Mrs. Pond has arranged a cold supper for this hour. You are all welcome to stay." She stood from her chair. She was not performing anything. She was simply done with the room, and there was somewhere else she wanted to be. She crossed the main hall and went through the service passage and into the east wing corridor, her footsteps on the flagstones, the familiar cold coming up from the stone as it always did. The fire she had laid in the study 2 mornings ago had been laid again since, by someone. The grate clean and the coals new. She stood in the doorway of the study and looked at the small portrait on the wall beside the window, its curtain drawn back on both sides now, fully in the light. The varnish had been cleared. Ramsay's work was present in its full original state, the silk of her mother's gown reading exactly as he had said it would, with a warmth and a precise attention that the cloud of old varnish had hidden for years. She stood there for a moment, looking at her mother's face. She heard Daniel's step in the corridor behind her and turned only slightly, not to face him, just to acknowledge that she knew he was there. He stopped in the doorway and looked, as she had looked, at the portrait. "She wrote to me," he said, when she knew she was dying. "She had heard that I occasionally made the kind of journey I made to this house. She asked whether, in time, I might make it here." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She was thinking of a woman writing a letter, dying, choosing the word in time because she was honest about what she was asking. "How long ago did she write to you?" she asked. 12 years. She let that settle. He had carried it for 12 years and had come when he judged the moment to be right, which, given what she now understood of him, was the only way he would have come at all. "You might have been direct," she said. It was not quite an accusation. It was the statement of a woman who preferred plainness and was applying the standard fairly. "If I had come as the Duke of Carrow," he said, "and introduced myself as someone your mother asked to call upon you, your aunt would have managed the introduction very carefully. You would have met me across a drawing room with every available care taken to present you advantageously. I would not have learned anything true." She thought about this. She thought about the coals and the cold, and the portrait list she had compiled from her uncle's records, and the conversation in the gallery about Ramsay's interest in fabric. "And did you?" she asked. "Learn anything true?" He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved outside the window, and the candle in the sconce on the east wall wavered once and settled. "More than I expected to," he said, with a plainness that matched hers. She looked at her mother's face in the portrait. The woman her aunt had described as a managed disgrace. The woman whose story had been the instrument of Eleanor's diminishment for 4 years, deployed in corridors and through ill-fitting doors as a warning about the limitations of what Eleanor was permitted to expect. The portrait showed her none of that. The portrait showed a woman in a silk gown painted by a man who found her interesting, with a quality of self-possession that had nothing apologetic in it. A woman, as Ramsay had apparently understood, who was worth the commission. Mrs. Pond appeared in the gallery doorway, paused, looked once between them with the careful expression of a woman who has been watching a thing develop and is prepared to be gratified by its conclusion. "Will you require the supper laid in here this evening?" she asked, directing the question to Eleanor with a neutrality so studied it was its own form of warmth. "Yes," Eleanor said. In the study, I think, for two. Mrs. Pond nodded in the way she nodded when things were as they ought to be, and withdrew without further ceremony. Daniel moved from the doorway into the study. He stood near the writing table, and Eleanor stood near the window, and between them her mother's portrait hung in the light that the cleared varnish had returned to it, exactly as it had always been, now fully visible. The supper was set at 6:30. The fire in the east wing study grate burned without smoke, because the wind had shifted off the north sometime in the afternoon, and the cold that had lived in the flagstones since the wing was sealed in 1824 seemed for this evening at least to have retreated to some other part of the house. They ate and talked, not about rank, not about connections, not about the terms of anything. They talked about the collection, about what he had found in the other 13 portraits that the records had not recorded. He knew things about 3 of them that confirmed they were misattributed, a fact Eleanor found genuinely interesting and said so. And they argued about it in the collegial way of 2 people who both know enough to make the argument worth having. At one point she said, "My mother would have enjoyed this conversation." And he said, "She did in fact enjoy it. She argued better than I did and was not modest about it." And Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, the kind that carries surprise in it. And the East Wing study, which had been cold and sealed and useful mainly for the housing of accounts and neglected canvases for the better part of a decade, held the sound of it comfortably. In the main drawing room, Lady Harriet sat with Mrs. Cleeve and spoke carefully about the alterations she had always intended to make to the East Wing, as though the afternoon had been of her own orchestration and had merely taken an unexpected form. Mrs. Cleeve listened with the expression of a woman storing every word precisely. Miss Fortescue and the Wentworth girl had their tea and said very little. The account books for Ashford Hall's household were still on Eleanor's writing desk in the main library, 4 years of entries in her hand, the household's true history recorded there in figures that did not lie about what she had done with the time she had been given. They would remain there. Nothing required her to move them now. But it was in the East Wing study, beside her mother's portrait, in the warm light of a fire that had been laid without instruction and had burned well, that the house felt, for the first time in the 4 years she had managed its running, entirely like a place where she belonged. Her hand rested for a moment on the edge of the writing table, the grain of the oak worn smooth at the corner where hands had rested before hers. She did not look at the portrait again. She did not need to. It was there and it was clear, and it would remain where it was. Outside, across the yard, the stable lad with the bucket had long since gone in from the cold. The gravel drive was empty. The November dark had settled over Ashford Hall with the completeness it always had at this hour, and the lights in the East Wing study burned on in the windows, visible from the lane and from the garden, and from the upper floor of the main house where Lady Harriet did not look out.